Throughout all of my years of education, the question that I was asked the most was, how do I study? Students of all ages, whether they were adults, high school students, middle school students, young students, kids, the whole nine, everyone always asked me, how do I study? So in this video, I'm going to give you sort of a condensed method of how I found success in education. If you don't have any study skill sets, I would suggest starting with this video and then building upon that from there. So you have to make it your own. But if you have nothing, if you're starting with nothing, this is a good place to start. So the very first thing in studying is you have to be organized. If you're not organized, then it's going to be very difficult to get anything done, whether it's studying, building a house, whatever, all the same thing. So for studying habits, to be organized, you really need to have a separate folder and a notebook for each class. I don't suggest using those 5 subject notebooks, having multiple classes stuffed into one folder. It just doesn't work. 1-to-1 ratio, 1 composition notebook and 1 folder for each class. That's what I do. And then you're only going to work on one thing at a time. So if you have art, history, science, and a math class, you shouldn't have all of those subjects out in front of you at the same time. You should only work on one thing at a time. So let's say, for example, you set aside an hour to study Spanish. Well, you should only be studying Spanish for that hour. Don't have any history books out. Don't have any art books, no science books, nothing like that. One subject at a time. And then, this is the most crucial step. This is one that a lot of students skip, especially younger students. You need to study at a table or a desk. Don't study in bed. Bed is for sleeping. Your mind and your brain is wired to sleep in the bed, not to study. So make sure you get a desk, a table, somewhere that you can sit upright and really get to work. So once you're organized, now it's time for the studying to actually begin. So step 2A of studying is you need to pre-read before class starts. So what does that mean? When you're pre-reading, you're really just trying to understand the overall concept of the lesson. You're not really trying to get a lot of details. You're not trying to completely overstand the lesson, if you will. You're just trying to get familiar with some of the terms. Good thing to look out for during the pre-reading is vocab. If there's any vocab that's being highlighted in the text, make sure that you understand the vocab, because that's the vocabulary that your professor or your teacher is going to use in front of you during the class. So a big point is that class should not be the first time that you see the material. If you see the material for the first time when you get in front of the teacher, you're behind the curve, because the teacher expects you to do some of the reading before you get to class. So that way everyone can speak the same language and we can just talk about what the language actually means and the implications of the language. So when you're pre-reading, you should write down at least 3 to 5 questions and ask them in class. A lot of times these questions will be answered by the professor or the teacher during the lecture. So if they're answered during the lecture, make sure you take notes of it. If they're not answered during the lecture, do not hesitate to raise your hand and ask the question. When you ask questions in class, 2 things will happen. Number 1, you're going to increase your understanding of the material. And honestly, that's the most important thing. The second thing that's going to happen is your classmates will grow to hate you. Sorry, that's just a byproduct of being a good student. Most students feel comfortable by not asking questions. To most students, asking questions makes the lecture go on for longer. The people that feel that way usually don't do that well in the class. So you're there to get your education. You're either paying for it or your parents are paying for it. So step up, ask the questions, because you've earned the right to do so. If you're leaving class without asking questions or having your questions answered, you did it wrong. So the next step is, what do you do after class? So after class, that's when you start the rereading and the transformation step. So the transformation step and the rereading step, this is a very, very active step. This is where most people start to study. But If you're a good student, you already had 2 steps done before you got here. So what does rereading mean? Rereading means actually going back into the textbook and rereading the textbook. So you already read it once. Now you're reading it again with the knowledge that you learned in class. So all those things that didn't make sense before the first time you read it is going to make a whole lot more sense now. And the lecture is going to serve as your reading guide. The headings of the lecture are usually correspond to headings in the textbook. So if your professor is going over certain sections, those are the sections that you should be rereading. And it's directly proportionate. The more time that they spend on it in class, the more important it is to the test that they have in mind for you. So the lecture, you should be taking notes and figuring out, remember where this stuff was in the book. If you can't remember it, guess what you need to do? You need to go back and reread that stuff in the textbook. Pretty simple. Okay, now the transformation step. This one is where studying becomes personal and it becomes fun. So transforming your notes, what does that mean? That means going back into your notebook and highlighting the notes. What's important, what's not. Making flashcards, charts, creating a story and art. Anything to make the knowledge more personal. So, you can't just take what you learned in a classroom and just leave it there. If you leave it up there, your professors they have degrees in this content area. So they've already done all this. It's not their job to make it personal for you. You have to take that material and you have to transform it into a way that you can understand it. Don't be afraid to quote unquote dumb it down for yourself. That's one of the things I would do all the time in chemistry as a chemistry student. I would take these abstract concepts and tell wild stories about it to make it personal. So anything that'll help you remember it, that's what transformation of the notes requires. And then at this point, you should really be starting to practice problems in the homework. A common problem that I see, especially with math students, is they never read before class. They never read the textbook. They just want to take notes in class and then go and do the homework. That's what I used to do. And it doesn't work that way. You have to read the book, transform the notes, then start to practice problems. And then during your practice problems, you're inevitably going to come up with more questions. Write those questions down and make sure they get answered in class the next time you go back. If you're coming back, every time you come to class, you should come with questions, period. The more questions you ask, the better student you will be. Okay, now step 3. This is usually after 2 classes and 2 study sessions. So you had the pre-read, you had class, you had a reread, then you had class again. Now you're back at home studying for the 3rd time. Okay, this is your review session. So now you're going to reread your transformed notes. At this point, it should be so personal that you really understand all of the concepts. You're able to relate multiple areas of knowledge together. Remember, your education is a continuum. There's no such thing as art is separate from music, it's separate from English, it's separate from science. No, it's all together. Your education is one big continuous platform. So anything you've ever learned is all part of your education. Bring it to the classroom. It's okay. So you're going to reread your transformed notes. And then you're going to review the personal questions that you had throughout your studying sessions. Okay, did all of your questions get answered? If so, what was the professor's answer? Does that help you understand it more? Okay, review that. If it doesn't help you, if you're still not clear, guess what? Go back to the textbook. And then now you should be doing more practice problems. Perhaps maybe you didn't finish all of the homework. If you're in college, usually homework is due every other class. So maybe you have time to do the homework. Or if you've already turned in the homework, go back and do some more practice problems. The book is chock full of practice problems. And your professor, your teacher is only going to assign a few of them to you. So go back and do some more practice problems so that way, bam, you're even more prepared. All right. And then at this point, once you've done all the practice problems that you can do and you reviewed all your notes, now it's time to start the section chapter review questions. Those are the ones that come at the end of the chapter, at the end of the section, especially in math and science classes. Guess what? More than likely, most of those questions are going to show up on the quiz or exam. Maybe not the same numbers, but the same types of questions. Because here's a little hint. As a former teacher and as a college professor, I was a PTL, your professors, your teachers are lazy. In other words, they got a lot of shit going on. So they don't have time to write test questions. They're going to get it from a test bank. And the bank is